There's just something magical about shooting vibrant sunsets like this. Honestly, it's one of my absolute favorite moments as a landscape photographer. But as beautiful as it looks, it can be a real pain to expose correctly because of the bright highlights and the deep shadows of the scene. But don't worry, I'll walk you through exactly how I expose scenes like this step by step. And in the second half of the video, we'll jump into Lightroom and edit this photo together. I did shoot this location before, but I wasn't really happy with the empty sky. Checking the weather forecast for this evening, things looked much more promising. Partly clouded was exactly what I was looking for. Plus, the app I use for light predictions had a decent chance of a proper sunset. So I had to give the spot another try. It's a small chapel on a hill with a few trees surrounding it. To find the best composition, it's wise to be on location early enough so you can scout the place a bit. Take your time. My first thought was to capture the chapel from the side with the sunset right behind it and light coming through the windows. I placed my camera rather close to the subject, making it appear bigger, while using a 16mm wide-angle focal length, which gets me enough of the sky in the frame for the clouds, but also some foreground below the subject. After fiddling around with the settings for a while, I still wasn't happy with the shot. The composition lacked a lot of depth. So I decided to change the position, shooting the chapel from a 45-degree angle, which thanks to the light and shadows gave it a way stronger 3D-like effect, making everything look a lot more impactful. Once the composition is set up, it's time to think about the camera settings. Keep in mind, to get the full potential out of the shot, you want to shoot in RAW, since we will later fine-tune the exposure in Lightroom, and RAW files will give you way more flexibility. As always, I'm shooting in manual mode, which gives me full control over shutter speed, aperture and ISO. But before we adjust those, make sure the camera's histogram is enabled. This makes it a whole lot easier to see when areas in the highlights or in the shadows are clipping. With modern day digital cameras, we want to prevent clipping in the highlights, because once the highlights are gone, there is no way of recovering them, even when working with RAW files in Lightroom. Underexposure, on the other hand, can be fixed to a certain degree, so it's better to underexpose than overexpose in general. Now let's analyze this scene. We have a visible sun to the far left. That will be the brightest part of the frame. We have darker tones in the subject and in the foreground. Also, there is lots of wind resulting in movement in the clouds, the trees and grass. Having the sun in the frame like this, we can use it to our advantage, creating a sunstar effect by dialing down the aperture. In this case, I'm using f16. This adds another eye-catching element to the image. It's not necessarily needed, I just think it looks good. But that also means the aperture is fixed at f16. This leaves us with shutter speed and ISO to control the exposure. As we have a huge total range from bright highlights to deep shadows, I want to shoot a bracketed sequence, which we can later turn into an HDR image. I usually have the best results going with 5 images, each 2 stops apart. This results in a huge dynamic range later on when merging the images. It does have a downside because it kind of takes a bit to shoot those 5 images. During that time, movement can and will ruin the HDR, because there will be slight misalignments in moving things like grass, tree branches or even fast moving clouds. So in order to prevent that, I want to have a super fast shutter speed as my base for the bracketed sequence. In this case, I'm using something like 1/200th of a second. With the aperture being set to f16 and a rather fast shutter speed, we will end up with a darker image, which is also indicated by the histogram if we take a look at it. At this point we're going to crank up the ISO to nicely balance the exposure. If possible, I try to keep the histogram nicely balanced in the center, but I try to bring it as far as possible to the right side without clipping, so that we have more details in the shadows, which we can also recover later on. As we're shooting HDR, we shouldn't run into any issues anyway, but setting up the exposure this way, we also have the possibility to edit this image using only a single RAW file without the need for HDR. At least for me, that's helpful, because from time to time I just prefer working on a single file, as it can deliver better results. Now, don't be afraid of using higher ISOs. With modern cameras, you really shouldn't run into big issues here. I regularly shoot at around ISO 3200 with my Sony a7 Mark III, just like in this case. And now that we dialed in the settings, let's get this shot. As the sun is in the frame and I'm using a polarizing filter on my lens, this adds another layer of glass, so there will be lots of lens flare. To prevent that, I'm shooting a second bracketed sequence. This time, however, I'm blocking the sun with my index finger. These two HDRs can later be combined for a much cleaner image. I also wanted to capture a more reduced version of this chapel, meaning I want to take out all unnecessary objects and focus more on the subject. For this purpose, a vertical shot fits perfectly, since the chapel will take up a bigger portion of the image, but I still have the clouds and the grassy foreground in the frame. I do lose the sunstar on the left, but I think it actually makes the whole composition look cleaner. In the end, I preferred the vertical version a lot more, but what do you think? By the way, if you're shooting sunrises or sunsets like these, be patient. Waiting a few more extra minutes is almost always worth it, because oftentimes the best light comes right after sunset or right before sunrise, with the clouds rapidly changing colors. And now that we have our shots, let's take a look at the editing process in Lightroom. And of course, as always, feel free to follow along by downloading the RAW file from the link in the description. And while you're down there, maybe also subscribe to this channel if you want to support my work here. Thank you. Here we are in Lightroom. Down below in the film strip you can already see the HDR sequence. I just want to point out, this image could probably be edited using only one RAW file with the base image right here, since as you can see, when I open up the basic panel, I can restore all the details from the highlights and the shadows by adjusting just these sliders. However, that's not what I want to do. I want to make use of the whole dynamic range, so I'm combining all these images down below into an HDR file. So select all of them, right click, go to photo merge and choose HDR. Alright, and without changing anything here, I'm hitting the merge button. Lightroom will then create a new file for us, this one right here, which is our HDR image. And now we can edit it. First off, you can see the church is kind of leaning towards the left side. I want to fix that. I'm going to head into the transform panel for that. And what I want to do is I want to kind of rotate the image slightly. Plus, I also want to use the vertical slider to fix the vertical lines, which are a little skewed right now because of the wide angle lens I was using here. So I'm going to bring up the vertical slider, and this way I can nicely fix the skewed lines. That's looking really good. Now you can see there is a huge gap at the top of the image. I can make use of the Y offset slider, bringing it up, kind of shifting the image a little further up to the top, filling those gaps. Alright, looks much better. Now that we have fixed that, I'm going to also crop the image slightly, kind of getting rid of these gaps, keeping the church nicely centered like that, and I will fill any remaining gaps in Photoshop later on. What I'm going to do next is the basic stuff. So let's open up the basic panel. I'm going to change the profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard. This will lessen the overall contrast, and in turn I do have more control over the contrast myself. Now for the exposure, I want to start by bringing up the exposure. so we make the whole shot a little bit brighter. For the same effect, I'm going to raise the shadows, which really helps for this image. Since there are a lot of shadows in the foreground, I can also bring up the blacks. Alright, looking much better already. Now for the highlights, you can see there is still a very bright part in the sky, which is slightly overexposed. I'm going to bring down the highlights to save them. Now we did lose a bit of contrast due to these adjustments. I want to start working on bringing it back. Therefore we can simply push the whites up a notch. Just being very, very careful to not introduce too much overexposure. For that, I'm paying close attention to the histogram, but right here, that's a great spot. Then, after adjusting the exposure, I usually continue by working on the white balance. I want this shot to feel a little warmer, so I'm going to bring up the temperature, just right around here. And I also want to bring down the tint, because I feel like there's a strange purple color cast going on. I think with these white balance settings, we're in a good place. Now I'm continuing by adding some texture, giving this whole shot a little more sharpness. I'm also going to bring up the clarity a notch. I do want to have a dreamy glow effect on top. Therefore, I'm using some negative dehaze to introduce such an effect. Perfect. Then let's bring up the vibrance and the saturation because I want this image to be vibrant. Alright, and that's the shot after the basic adjustments. Let's compare to before real quick. Exposure wise, it's looking much better with a lot more details in both the highlights and the shadows. The colors are more saturated, but they do look a little bit strange at the moment, but don't worry about that. We are going to fix it in a minute. First, however, I want to continue with a bit of masking. So let's open up the masking panel. Right away, I want to work on the sky. I'm going to click on range, and here I'm choosing a color range mask because I want to target the blue tones of the sky right here. Now, of course, we are selecting way more than needed. I'm going to click on those three dots, go to intersect mask with and choose select sky. This way we are making sure we are only selecting the blue tones within the sky. Still, I want to further modify this mask. I'm going to subtract a linear gradient and I'm taking out the bottom part of this mask because I want to make the top part of the sky darker. So we don't need to select the bottom part. And now what I'm going to do is to bring down the blacks, making the darker parts of the sky at the very top darker. And instantly we are adding way more contrast between the blues of the sky and those bright clouds, which always looks really cool. I'm also going to bring up the contrast, which will further boost this effect. And let's even add a bit of clarity. And I'm also going to bring up the temperature, introducing just a little more warmth to the top of the sky. Alright, that looks great. Then let me use another sky selection. This time I'm subtracting a linear gradient and I'm taking out the top part of the sky, because I want to target the brighter parts of the sky specifically. And what I want to do in here is to further bring up the temperature, making the brightest parts of the sky even warmer. We can further work on this effect by clicking on this little color box and adding a specific color to this part of the sky. So I want to go with something in the orange range, somewhere around here. And let's also slightly push the saturation, making the sky just more vibrant in this area. Okay, now next I want to work on the whole foreground. Again, I'm starting with the sky selection and then just click the invert checkbox, and just like this we're getting a perfect selection for the foreground. What I want to do in here is to bring up the clarity first. This will give the foreground a lot more punch. I also feel like the colors are a little off in here, so I'm going to use the white balance temperature slider. I'm going to slightly drop it, making the whole foreground look a little bit colder. At the same time, the colors are a little too intense for my taste, so I'm also going to bring down the saturation. Perfect. Then let's introduce some glow coming in from the left side where the bright spot is. I'm using a radial gradient for that. Let's make it nice and big like this. I'm placing the center of this radial gradient outside the image where the sun is supposed to be. I'm also making sure I'm overlapping parts of the foreground and the chapel. And then to introduce glow, I'm simply going to bring up the blacks and I'm going to drop the dehaze. Alright, that's looking great. We could even play around with the colors, making this glow effect a little bit warmer by introducing more temperature. Wonderful. Let's see, maybe I'm going to make this radial gradient just a little bit bigger, so the glow effect will become more obvious. Then let's work on the foreground for a minute. I'm using a linear gradient with which I try to target most of the grass right here. Of course, I don't want to affect the chapel itself, so I'm going to say subtract and choose select subject to clean up this mask. Wonderful. Then what I want to do for that area is to further bring up the clarity, giving the grass just some more structure this way. I'm also going to bring up the exposure. Okay, and I actually think the grass could use more saturation. Let me pull up the saturation just a little bit, giving the green tone some more punch. Wonderful. I'm going to use another linear gradient for the very near foreground right here, because I want to kind of add a vignetting effect, making the bottom darker. What I need to do for that is to simply pull down the exposure, and just like that, it instantly looks much better, kind of pulling the eye more towards the center of the image. Let's also work on the subject itself. Let's create a simple select subject mask. Thanks to the overlay, you can see there's a little more selected than needed. I'm going to subtract with the brush, and let's just clean up this part. I don't know why Lightroom is selecting this. All right. Now I want to make the subject brighter by bringing up the exposure. I'm also going to bring up the whites. Of course, in a physical way, this doesn't make sense because the light comes from behind the subject and the subject should lie in the shadows, kind of. So again, it doesn't make sense from a physical standpoint, but I think it just looks better this way. I'm also going to bring up the contrast. And I do think I want to bring up the temperature, kind of eliminating that blue color cast in the subject. Okay, let's see, maybe bring up the saturation a bit, and that's about it. And now there's one more thing I want to do, and that's to introduce some more heavier lights and shadows to the foreground. This is a little tricky to do, I think. I'm going to start with a linear gradient, and right here in the back you can see some shadow of that chapel. I want to emphasize this, so I'm going to draw the linear gradient along this shadow. Let's pull it down a bit. All right, then I'm going to subtract a linear gradient, taking out everything that's supposed to be in the light. I think you can already kind of see what I'm doing here, creating some artificial shadow for this chapel. Of course, the subject is still selected, so we want to subtract and choose select subject. And there we have our mask for the artificial shadow. For that, I'm simply going to pull down the exposure. I'm going to pull it down quite a bit to make it really obvious, just like this. Now I want to do the opposite, also introducing light for the foreground. Therefore, let me create another linear gradient. Now, of course, I'm targeting everything except for the shadow. And of course, I also don't want to target the sky. I'm actually going to subtract the linear gradient, taking out pretty much everything except for the grass. Let's subtract the subject, and let's also subtract the foreground, because we don't really need the very near foreground to become brighter. I think this is looking good. Now what I'm going to do is to bring up the exposure, and just like that we are creating light. Of course, this might be a bit too heavy, so we need to further adjust this mask. I'm going to tone down the size here. Just want to have some more highlights in the back right here. That looks good. I also want to make the light that is hitting the grass look a little warmer. So I'm going to bring up the temperature, giving it an intense golden light. And we're going to bring down the saturation because that's way too much. Wonderful. I'm also going to add this effect to the back right here. So let me choose another. Actually, no, let me create a sky selection. I'm going to invert this. Then let's subtract the subject, and let's subtract a linear gradient, taking out everything except for that bright spot in the back. Okay, I want to clean this up a little further. So I'm subtracting a brush. There are parts selected around the chapel, which is really, really strange. I don't know why, but that's looking good. Now, again, I'm going to bring up the exposure. I'm going to bring up the temperature. And I'm going to pull down the saturation. All right, and that's it. So I think we're done with the masking. Let me turn off all the masks to see the difference from our base image to after with masks applied. Again, masking makes a huge difference in getting the exposure right and adding these kind of special effects to an image. Now let's take a closer look at the colors with the color grading. Let's head out of the masking panel and we want to start in the color mixer. I'm going to work on the hue for a second because I really don't like these intense yellow tones. I want to make them look more orange, so I'm going to use the yellow hue slider and slightly bring it down. This makes everything look much better in my opinion. Now let's head over into the saturation tab. First I want to bring up the red saturation for the roof of the chapel. Then I want to kind of tone down all the other colors a bit because they might be a bit too intense. That means I'm going to drop orange, I'm going to drop yellow, and I'm going to drop the blues. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I also want to work on the luminance. Here we are going to use the blue luminance slider, and by bringing it down we can add a little more contrast to the sky, as this will make all the blue tones of the image darker. Okay, now let's get a little more creative with the split toning in the color grading panel. I'm going to start with the highlights, and since we're working with the golden hour sunset, I'm going to make it more intense by adding a warm color tone to the highlights. So let's set up the hue. I'm going with something around here, and I'm going to pump up the saturation to make it visible. Wonderful. Let's also head into the midtones, and let's bring up the hue first. Again, I'm using pretty much the same color tone, and let's bring up the saturation again. This time I'm not going as crazy as with the highlights, I just want to keep it subtle for the midtones. Then I'm going to head into the shadows, and here we can use some color contrast, meaning I'm going to add a cold color tone to the shadows to balance things a little bit. And let's bring up the saturation. Alright. Then we could also make use of the global color wheel, which will just add a color globally. I'm going to use this and add a warm hue again. So somewhere around here, and let's bring up the saturation like this. Wonderful. Then the final part of the color grading will be happening in the calibration tab, and as always, that's just something I do for most of my images. I'm going to bring down the blue primary hue, which will shift the colors in a very pleasing way. And I'm going to pump up the saturation. This looks awesome. Now the only thing left to do in Lightroom is the sharpening, so let's go into the details tab, and I'm going to bring down the radius, increase the details, hold down the Alt key while adjusting the masking slider so we can nicely target the areas which should get sharpened, and let's bring up the amount of sharpening. Done. Then let's clean up the shot in Photoshop. I'm going to right click on the image, go to edit in and choose open as smart object in Photoshop. I'm going to duplicate this layer by hitting Ctrl J. Then we want to right click on that new layer and click on rasterize layer so we can work on it. I'm going to use the lasso tool for this gap right here, make a rough selection, hit Shift F5 under contents, choose content aware and click OK. Done. Now there are a few things I want to clean up. There is a little bit of lens flare in that hill in the distance. I'm going to just brush over it using the spot healing brush. And I'm also going to brush over this spot right here. All right, let's see. Should I get rid of this thing? Looks better. I do think I want to add a little more glow. So let me create a new layer, and I'm going to change the blending mode to, let's go with hard light. I'm going to grab the brush by pressing B. Let's adjust the brush size and make it super, super soft. Then we want to bring down the brush opacity to around 10%. And we want to pick up a foreground color from the bright part in the sky. For that, I'm simply holding down the Alt key and click in here. Now, I'm going to paint in here once or twice to add this glow effect. Okay, this might be a bit too intense. I'm changing the blending mode to soft light, which is a more subtle effect, but this looks great. I'm going to do the same on the other side. Okay, and with that we are done editing this image. Let me know what you think about the whole process going from capturing the image to editing it in Lightroom. Do you want to see more of these kind of videos, or do you have any other questions left? Looking forward to reading all your comments, and thank you so much for watching this video.